the state forecast was released yesterday, and we are fortunate to have Josh Lehner with us this morning to discuss the economic future, at least for the next quarter. So thank you, Josh, for joining us. We have close to 200 attendees on this forum, so we will be going through our regular process of presentation, and then we will take Q&A in the Q&A and in the chat room. I'll be monitoring that along with Josh. But at this point, what I'd like to do is recognize our Westside Economic Alliance board members that are with us this morning. So Teresa, will you put that slide up, please? I'm happy to welcome as many board members as we have attending today. That's really a good showing. Thank you all for the work that you do for our organization. I'd also like to recognize the elected officials that are with us this morning. Thank you as well for the outstanding work that you do for everyone in Washington County and throughout the state. It's much appreciated, and I know especially during this pandemic, you're all working very hard, and again, my special thanks to you. At this point, I'd like to thank Legacy, our breakfast series sponsor, for their continuing support of our forum series here, and I want to thank them especially for the work that you're doing throughout this pandemic to keep us all healthy and safe. So special thanks to Legacy Health. And now what I'd like to do is introduce Dave Robertson. Dave is the Vice President of Public Policy at PGE. PGE has been a longtime partner with Westside Economic Alliance. We appreciate the support that you've provided to us over the years and the partnership that you have with Westside Economic Alliance and with all the communities that you serve, especially in Washington and Clackamas County. So welcome, Dave.
Thank you, Pam, so much. It's always a great pleasure to be here at the Westside. Hey, I spent a lot of time, and it's also really my great pleasure to be able to introduce Josh today, which I'll do in just a second. It's going to be a great breakfast. I think we'll learn a ton, so I'm really looking forward to that. First, I've spent the last several years really thinking a lot about PGE's overall strategy to decarbonize our power supply, to help all of you decarbonize your vehicles and your buildings and such. Also, smart grid, operational excellence, and all that work. And I can bore you with a 20-minute speech about our deep decarbonization study or our smart grid plan or some such thing. But today I really want to just take a moment to thank all of you for what's been really a very difficult couple of weeks. Whether you own a business or you're working from home, the windstorms and the wildfires have been a pretty scary and devastating time for all of us. For PGE, we restored almost 250,000 customers who were out of power during the storm. And our territory goes from Portland down to Salem and then Mount Hood to the Coast Range. And so in all that area, we serve, I think our customer count, which really kind of is the number of meters we have, is about 900,000. And so 250,000 customers restored is more than we've had in many years. We proactively shut off power for the first time at Mount Hood to about 5,000 customers. And then we actively shut off power in advance of the fires with 8 different communities, really in a partnership with the local first responder agencies and the local leaders in the various towns like Colton and Scotts Mills and Estacada. So it's really, during times like this, we are just immensely grateful to all of you for your patience, for your partnership, and the public-private partnerships during times of crisis like that really come through. And these partnerships really were crucial for us to restoring public safety and essential services, not only our own service, but helping you who are working on water and sewer to try to get your service back up and running. And these partnerships really came through at midnight on Labor Day, on the day of the storm. Randy Ely, our Westside board member, and Troy Gagliano, who works for our team, got on the phone with Forest Grove Fire Chief Mike Kincaid, TVF&R Chief Derek Weiss, John Wheeler at Washington County Emergency Management Services, and we really started to get squared away on how we're going to communicate during this event. Later in the week, Randy got Chief Weiss connected with our CEO, Maria Pope, and our Vice President of the Electric Grid, Larry Becketall, and they really started kind of digging in on some specifics. And then we also received an offer of mutual aid for our crews. You know, we often in the electric business have a really great practice of sharing crews when we need them. So Pacific Corps often shares crews with us and vice versa. This time we got a great call from Mayor Truax and the Forest Grove Light and Power team to share a mutual aid crew, which we're super grateful for that. We also got help from Washington County Department of Land Use and Transportation, and Steve Roberts helped get Jackson School Road open so we could restore some damage up there from the storm. We also got other WEA members reaching out to us, from Mayor Doyle, Mayor Callaway, Mayor Bubenek, Mayor Truax, of course I mentioned, Mayor Axelrod, Washington County Chair Catherine Harrington. So just to all of you guys, thank you so much for this partnership. And I think this type of public-private partnership is really what I love about Westside Economic Alliance. And it really just embodies that. And I don't, you know, I've been on the Westside board, I've been on the Portland Business Alliance board, the OBA board, the OBI board, the Alphabet Soup board. And I can tell you there's some uniqueness to the WEA board that I hope you all appreciate. And that is that you've got elected officials, businesses, and nonprofits all at the same table. And that, in those times when you're sort of building that relationship, in times of crisis like the one we had, that's when that really shines and comes through. I just want to thank Pam for being a leader in pulling this partnership approach together and keeping that alive. You know, you do that not only just through your board work, but also your events. When you think about when we actually could get together in person at the last WEA event where you had Washington County's first responders, I got to go meet Derek Weiss from TVF&R at the end of that. And that really, Randy, of course, knew him for many years, but that was just super helpful when we got down to it on this storm. So the event today is just another great example. We've got Josh Lehner, a state economist from Oregon, here to talk a little bit about what's going on. He's from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis, and he develops the state's quarterly economic forecast, including outlooks for employment, income, housing, and the lottery. He's also has a master's degree in economics from Portland State and an undergraduate degree from the University of Colorado. And above all, he's famous. So just know not only is he an expert, but he's been cited in many national news outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, and The Economist. So we'll welcome him in just a sec. So the final statement that Pam wants me to make sure I let you know is that post your questions for Josh in the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting, and Pam and Josh will work to make sure that they get answered through the event today. So thanks, Pam, for everything you guys do. Thanks, Josh, for being here today. Really looking forward to the discussion. So take care. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Pam. Pleasure to be back with you all this morning. Here, let me share my screen. Yesterday, our office released the latest economic revenue forecast for the state. This is the second one we've done since the pandemic. We first put out a forecast in May, which was the first one associated with, since the pandemic and the shutdown and everything like that. And we built in a really, really severe recession, the largest we'd seen on record. The only data we had to work with at that time was this tidal wave of unemployment claims. Initial claims for unemployment insurance is what they're called. It's basically people saying, hey, I'm getting laid off, or I'm about to get laid off. I want to start, tapping into those benefits that we've been paying into for years and years to take advantage of it so that I can tide myself over while I look for another job. And that was just such a large tidal wave of claims. We thought we would see about 20% job loss and 20% unemployment rate. And the good news is, and what we updated yesterday, is we didn't see something that bad. The economy is still in bad shape. There's a lot of issues going on, and then we'll talk about these, but we're in a relatively better position than we thought. And then the state tax revenues are not only up relative to forecast, the state revenues are actually up on a year ago basis. They're up. Like they're not, there's been no recessionary impact to date, or at least not a very large one, associated with our state revenues. That impact is coming. There's always a delay built into a lot of tax collections relative to the state of the economy, because we only file tax returns once a year. Well, some of us on a quarterly basis, but a lot of us, we only true up, once a year. And so there's going to be some impact coming, but we're just surprised that we haven't seen an impact at all yet, even though we have, basically we had record unemployment. This first slide is just trying to show that dichotomy I was talking about, right? The chart on the left looks at the average unemployment rate. So it's kind of a goofy measure, but 6 months of unemployment rate, averaging it to match this shutdown period, or the shutdown plus the post-shutdown period. And you can see, right, the unemployment rate today in Oregon is every bit as bad as it was during the worst of the Great Recession. That's the chart on the left. The chart on the right is income tax collections, at least once we adjust for the kicker, which, obviously when you give out a $1 billion kicker, you get less money in the actual door, but that's due to an accounting issue and a forecast issue on our end from, at this point, 2.5 years ago, when we made the forecast that created the kicker last time. And so if you strip that out and you just look at the underlying growth in income and taxes paid through the door in the same time period since the shutdown and post-shutdown period, our income taxes are up, and the same thing for corporate too. And so this dichotomy where the economy is bad, but our state tax revenues not only look fine, they look good and have shown growth, is something that we were just as shocked as the budget writers were when we released this yesterday. And so with that, want to go into some of the reasons why we're seeing it and what we think the outlook will look like from here going forward. The first one is, as I was saying, is the economy is not as bad as feared. This chart shows employment loss by recession in Oregon in recent decades. The way you read these charts is you start in the upper left-hand corner at 0. That's how many jobs you had at the start of a recession before the recession hit. As you drop down, that's the severity of the recession, how far you fall. As you work your way back up and to the right, that's the recovery. You're gaining jobs, but you're still worse than you were prior to the onset of the recession. And as you hit 0 again, that means you fully regained your recessionary losses and you're at an all-time high for employment. And so you can see the red lines, they look nothing like past business cycles. This came upon us so swift and so quick. It looks much more like a natural disaster. And with the virus, maybe it kind of should fit in the natural disaster type of related recessions and economic disruptions, as opposed to a normal business cycle. And so we saw a massive severe recession overnight, not as severe. We saw 14% job loss when we were expecting 20% job loss. And we've had this initial rebound. Now we're expecting this rebound to slow down in the next, 6-12 months, as a lot of the reasons for this quick snapback had to do with the recalls of those on temporary layoffs, right? We shut down bars and restaurants and nail salons and movie theaters and the like, and we've reopened those up to a certain degree. Now restaurants can only have 50% capacity and what have you. So we've seen a nice snapback in economic activity as expected. It's maybe happened a little bit quicker than we assumed, and that relative starting point for the recovery is better than we assumed. And so that's an important point to keep in mind when we talk about things are better than expected. Well, we thought they would be near depression levels, and right now they're just really bad economically from the employment side of things. And so overall, we've also improved our forecast over the entire horizon. Previously, we thought it'd be a 4-year recovery timeline. As you can see in the dotted line, or the dotted line. And now we're thinking it's going to be more like a 3-year recovery, as you can see in the dashed line, the other red line. So overall, we think things are better, expected today, and the recovery path will be a little bit quicker. And I'll go into some of the key reasons why we're thinking that. And the first one is the impact of federal policy. You know, the Federal CARES Act pumped a couple $1 trillion into the U.S. economy in the matter of months. Here in Oregon, it looks like we received around $14 billion of that. It's split about equally. $7 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans for small businesses in Oregon, about $7 billion to Oregon households. And that $7 billion to households is about 50-50 split between the one-time recovery rebates, the $1,200 per person, $500 per child, and the expanded or enhanced unemployment insurance benefit. That's about $3.5 billion above, you know, pre-COVID levels in recent months as well. So that's a large amount of federal support to households in such a short amount of time that incomes today are actually higher than they were prior to the pandemic, right? Incomes are up today relative to pre-COVID because of the federal aid. If you remove this federal assistance, what are called transfer payments in the data, that's what the word transfer payments means. It's just the way the income data is coded. You look at that light blue line, incomes are down, right? And they're down enough, about 5% or so. That is as big of a shock to the underlying income absent federal support. That's as big of a shock as we saw in the Great Recession, which kind of matches that employment data, right? We have a Great Recession-sized hole left to go. It's just what's different this time, what is unprecedented, is we've had such large federal support to plug that goal. Not only plug the hole, but has plugged the hole large enough to make up the gap and have higher incomes today. And so what does this mean? Well, this means consumer spending has held up, right? As soon as we started restricting, unrestricting some of these consumer options, some of these forward-facing consumer industries in the service sector, bars and restaurants and the like, and some forms of retail, we've seen a really large rebound in spending. As you know, pin-up demand. There's two types of pin-up demand. There's the type of pin-up demand that, hey, I wanted to go out to eat, but I couldn't. So maybe I'll go out to eat twice this month or this week instead of once this week because I couldn't do it. I needed to get a permit from the city, but the city was shut down in order to flatten the curve and the like. And so I'm going to get that permit. And so some of our public sector agencies are working double time or so to speak, more recently to make up for that backlog that built up during the shutdown phase. The other type of pent-up demand is I have a lot of money in my pocket. I have more money in my pocket kind of burning a hole, and I'm itching to spend it. And that is also another type that is going on in the economy. So it means the consumers are doing better than feared because of this income support. And because of all of this combined, the higher incomes, the reduction in spending during the shutdown phase, it means U.S. households overall have built up a tremendous amount of savings. We have 1.2, 1.3 trillion more sitting in bank accounts around the country than we did before the pandemic. There's been a massive spike in savings because we have incomes up, spending down, and it's just kind of accumulating there. And it's just being parked in checking accounts if you look at the banking data. And so should this be unleashed in the next 6 months, the next 12 months, the next 24 months, that will go a long way to offsetting other weaknesses in consumer spending related to the poor economy, because all this federal aid is gone, right? All of it's out the door, and we have no more aid today. And so we're worried about another leg down or the risk of a slowdown. We have that built into our forecast, a slowing in the economy, because this was kind of a one-time deal. It only lasted for a few months and has been tremendously beneficial, but it's gone. And so that savings that we can tap into will go a long way to helping the overall top line economic data, which will be good news by and large. But what it misses is the distributional concerns. You know, the impact across the income distribution and the wealth distribution has been really, really pronounced this cycle. And that's kind of what this next chart, slide 5, is getting at. Low wage workers, the red line here, people that work in sectors that pay less than $40,000 on an annual basis for the average worker. So it's leisure and hospitality, it's retail predominantly, childcare services, some of those sorts of things that pay low wages have disproportionately borne the brunt of the recession, right? That not only are they in sectors that are most impacted by social distancing and the shutdown, it's also the things where people are a little bit scared about the spread of the virus because you're closed indoors, more generally speaking, and so you can, have more concerns over the virus itself. And so this is where the biggest economic impact has been to date. And this red line really masks even pain within this, right? There's some of these sectors that didn't have to shut down, but bars and restaurants, they dropped by nearly 60% in terms of employment. Their sales dropped further than that temporarily, and now they've returned a little bit. And so, the number of people going out to eat, at least sitting down to go out to eat, is somewhere around down 50%, which is probably somewhere around the 50% capacity rules that we have due to the pandemic and the virus itself, right? And so we've seen a lot of economic pain. It's been almost entirely concentrated, or the vast majority is concentrated at the low end of the income distribution, which is concerning in the sense that, they're going to need assistance. The federal assistance is gone. They're going to have some increases in caseloads on the expenditure side of the budgets in terms of, maybe rent assistance and, healthcare assistance and food assistance and the like, right? We're probably going to be some expenditures associated with that coming up. But what it also means when high and middle income households have been impacted less, it means some of those total top line numbers look better than the underlying economy does because of income inequality, right? You can add up tens of thousands of low wage workers, but their impact on total spending, on total income in the state or in the US isn't as much as a handful of high income households, just due to the nature of the distribution and the fact that so much of our income is concentrated near the top. And if those folks are doing relatively better, as they are, then the impact on the total numbers that we generally talk about looks better. And so it kind of masks some of this underlying pain that we're seeing. Now, the other thing to point out here is we're seeing about 5% job losses in these middle and high wage sectors. That's a lot. That's still a lot. That 5% drop is more than the entire state of Oregon experienced in the 1973 recession, that's the oil crisis, in the 1990 recession, and the 2001 dot-com recession, right? That is still a severe shock to all of these sectors, just not as much as it was to those low wage sectors. But still, that relative composition income inequality effect is certainly propping up some of the spending today when you tack on that income support that we've seen in recent months from the federal government by and large. And so what does this mean for the outlook? Well, we're still very concerned about the state of the pandemic, and we're still really worried about this permanent damage associated with business closures and permanent layoffs, right? Normally, it takes a year or two for a recessionary shock to fully work its way through the economy. Something happens, there's a bad event, and then people don't generally fire their workers overnight, right? They generally kind of like pull back maybe on their investment decisions, maybe they pull back, they're not sticking their necks out, expanding or hiring more workers. They kind of wait and see to see how bad things will get. And then as they start getting less and less orders, for work, then they start to pull back on their employment. And as they pull back on their employment and lay some workers off, that then creates income problems for those laid off workers, and that reverberates through the economy and less spending. And we kind of get in that normal downward recessionary cycle. Well, we're only 6 months into this thing, right? We haven't had enough time for that underlying economic shock to work its way through the economy. And so we're not out of the woods in terms of pain, right? We think growth will continue, but that doesn't mean we're done with pain. And that normal recessionary shock is still reverberating through the economy. That's kind of what we're getting at with this slide. The things we're concerned about: business closures. We lack good information on when businesses close. Generally when people close, they don't ring up folks and say, hey, I'm shutting down. It's more of kind of a slow death. And then when they're not reporting taxes and they're not reporting, unemployment insurance taxes to the employment department for like 9 months, then where they can kind of assume that they've closed and things like that. So it's going to be a while before we get good data on firm closures. But what little information we do have, at least so far, is relatively encouraging. We can look at things like liquor licenses and video lottery retailers. These are bars and restaurants. So it's the one sector that we're primarily concerned about the largest number of closures being associated with it. And there, on liquor licenses, normally OLCC sees about a 98% renewal rate on a year basis, right? They kind of go in cohorts. Every quarter, about a fourth of the licenses are renewed just to try and work, manage the workload. Well, in June, the June quarter, that dropped to 92%, right? So that's 6% lower than normal. So that's an indication that a chunk of bars and restaurants went out. Doesn't mean they didn't have new ones going in, but there's a larger share were getting out of the industry, probably due to permanent closures. And on the video lottery retailer side, currently, or at least as of last month, 94% of video lottery retailers were reporting revenues, right? And they think there's only about a 4% closure rate there. So that the rest of the gap are people that are still in business, but they're not operating right now. They didn't want to open due to the pandemic. Maybe they didn't need to open. And so they're saying, we're going to wait and see before we do it. But there are some closures associated with that. But that, if we're talking a 5, 6, 7% closure rate, that's what we saw during the Great Recession, if not worse than that. We were kind of, again, expecting something worse than that, but time will tell. Again, this shock isn't done reverberating. I would expect more business closures in the months ahead. The relatively good news here is the chart on the left is new business applications. We thought we'd see more closures and less openings. And so that would exacerbate the problem of losing businesses and replacing them in the economy with startups to fill the roles and the needs that we have for goods and services. But it looks like the pipeline of new businesses coming into the economy hasn't declined. It's relatively the same as last year. This goes for this census data you see here in the chart. And if you look at actual applications at the Secretary of State's office for new business entities, that's all the way back too. So new businesses, that pipeline looks good, holding up at least so far. So that's encouraging on the business side of things. On the employment side of things, the chart on the right, we're looking, kind of taking the total employment picture and separating it out between those on temporary layoffs and on permanent layoffs the best that we can. We have imperfect data, taking some survey results and applying it. So it's a little bit of a mashed up numbers here, but it gets at the picture. Where the bulk of the declines were temporary in nature. Again, we're going to temporarily shut down bars and restaurants and nail salons, some social distance so that some manufacturers can't work at full go. You can only have a certain number of people on the floor and the like. And so these folks will be recalled when it's safe to do so and as business returns. And so we see that in the dark blue line, massive drop due to temporary layoffs, and that's where the improvement has been. And this is good news. The overall amount of economic pain in the economy is lessening. Things are improving. This is to be celebrated and good news. The one we're concerned about is that light blue line, permanent layoffs. These will be what takes time to recover from. Here we're looking at, a 3% loss related to permanent layoffs. So far, that's the part that's going to continue to accumulate through the rest of the year, most likely, before they start to improve. And then from there, it's going to take a couple of years to get permanent damage recovered from. These workers will have to find new jobs at different companies or even different sectors, different parts of the state, all that sort of different types of unemployment, whether it's cyclical or frictional or skills-based or geographic-based and the like, that takes a while to get back. And that's what we're concerned about. The temporary stuff's almost done, right? We're almost all the way done with our temporary layoffs relatively. Easy gains in the recovery are over or nearing completion today, maybe a couple more months. And then it's going to be a longer, harder slog from here on out, is at least our current thinking based on that. And I have a couple last slides to talk about, a lot of the bad things that have happened, right? We started with the global pandemic, and 2020 has just gotten worse. And one of, most recently, and for the biggest event, Oregon specific, West Coast specific, would be the wildfires. We don't know the extent of the damage yet. We're still tallying up number of people who lost their homes, property damages, how much of the forest was lost, and the like, but we know it's substantial. What's different about this is not only the severe nature of these, and obviously the wind event that caused them to come down the mountain, and Dave was talking about some of the things PGE did to help manage that so that we didn't see the same sort of fires on Mount Hood that we saw down in the Santiam Canyon or along the McKenzie River and the like, which I think should be, from a policy perspective, that was obviously all good stuff that helped prevent those from being like that across the entire state. But the losses are substantial. What's different, not only just the severe acreage, they also burn population centers or right next to population centers. So the economic damage this time isn't just due to the loss of recreational forest or logging lands. We've also lost a lot of structures, and we've closed highways. North-south, I-5, US 97 were shut down for periods of time. A lot of the east-west highways across the state were shut down. Some of them continue to be shut down. between like Roseburg and Klamath, and between Salem and Bend, right? Like these roads are still closed, so they're disrupting supply chains and having economic impacts even today, even as the fires are largely contained or gone, or at least out of the populated areas. And so it'll be a while before we get the full extent of this. You can see some of the numbers here. You know, 1 million acres burned. Here's some decomposition by counties we got from one of our advisors, forest economist. He put these together. They tend to be more private land than we typically see. And so that means more structures and more economic damage. We had 1% to 2% of the state in terms of property valuations, in terms of jobs, and in terms of the number of people were fully evacuated at one point in time. That's the level 3 evacuation, or within the fire perimeters themselves. You know, if you add in the people that were ready to go or on notice, the numbers are much, much larger than that, because it included the whole, you know, all of Clackamas County, all of Jackson County, and the like. Today, you know, what have we built into our forecast? We built in 2,000 additional housing starts for lost homes. We know the total number has now gone up to 4,000 homes. Right? That's something that came out this week. We didn't have time to build that into our forecast, the full amount. So we're going to have some additional housing starts. We're going to have some additional jobs related to that. And because of all this additional consumer spending on building materials, on cars, on personal belongings, and also associated with the evacuations, where you're going to see an increase in food and lodging sales while people are displaced. You know, the perverse way, through the lens that we look at a lot of this data, these are positive new economic activity, and that turns into new tax revenue associated with that. What we don't see in the normal economic accounts is the devastation and the loss of wealth and the loss of property, right? If a house that got destroyed that was built 50 years ago, it counted as economic activity 50 years ago. You know, the jobs and the GDP growth and the income from the sale and all that sort of stuff happened 50 years ago, and it's kind of not accounted for in the current growth numbers. But as we rebuild, these numbers will show up. So we think there'll be a near-term boost. What we're worried about is the long-term consideration. And so to the extent that larger, more frequent fires, particularly near cities, will result in the livability and the attractiveness and the quality of life being eroded, more people might, you know, fewer people might move to Oregon, more people might move out of Oregon as a result. That will impact our population numbers, our labor force numbers, and what we care about isn't growth for growth's sake. What we care about with the labor force gains and the like is local businesses having enough labor and enough labor to hire and expand. And the reason our labor force growth numbers and our population growth numbers are better than the typical state, and that allows our local businesses to hire and grow at a quicker pace than those in other states. And that's what really drives our overall faster total gains in the economy. And to the extent that wildfires or other sorts of disasters might alter that, then we're certainly considering that. Wildfires in and of themselves have the largest out-migration component out of other types of natural disasters, whether they're droughts or whether they're tornadoes or hurricanes or the like. Wildfires generate the most out-migration out of all the different types, according to some research that's been done. So again, that's something we're really concerned about. I think a offsetting factor to a certain degree is the fact that most of these communities that have been burned the most are within our urban areas. They're smaller rural towns on the outskirts, but they're not far flung. They're 15, 20, 30-minute commutes to Salem, to Eugene, to Medford. And so they're near our urban centers. The cities didn't burn. The jobs centers didn't burn. They still retain a lot of that employment growth and the faster gains. So the fact that they're not far-flung, geographically isolated communities is hopefully one mitigating factor. Plus, between FEMA and the private insurance, we should have a lot of money to rebuild. And hopefully our communities do rebuild entirely. The risk is that they do not. And so it's something to keep in mind moving forward. That's the current state of it. When we'll continue to work on some numbers as they become more tallied up and more firm, and we'll put those in our forecast a little bit further. But of course, the fires aren't the only thing that went wrong in 2020. We have a whole host of things, from the pandemic to the protests to the droughts, that are all potentially limiting our labor force gains and our overall economic growth in the long term if they adjust to that migration. The thing I'll say about protests, obviously it is legal and morally just to protest racial inequities, police brutality, elected officials, unidentified federal forces occupying your downtown, all that sort of stuff, right? It is not about whether you're in the right or wrong about that. That's a risk. It's not about the cost of graffiti. That's the risk. What we're worried about is that, you know, as the situation has evolved in the last 3-4 months, the focus isn't necessarily, or at least the broader narrative isn't on the social justice issues. The broader focus is on the violence, the clashes of violence that ultimately led to the death of someone, right? And so when that is the focus of what's going on, and you live 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away, and the nightly images about Portland isn't our you know, thriving economy, which Portland has had a very strong economy, one of the best economic expansions in the entire country last decade. When that's not the focus, and the focus isn't on the social inequities, it's on the violence, and you're seeing these terrible photos and videos broadcast around the country and being picked on by the president, you know, that could potentially hurt that perceived livability. And so in the long run, to the extent that that occurs, this time, you know, most of our advisors in our office don't think that'll happen, but to the extent that it does, that could be a risk, that longer forecast. The one bright spot for Oregon potentially to come out of all this is working from home. To the extent that working from home becomes a more permanent thing, Oregon stands to take advantage. We are the #2 state in the country for working from home, behind Colorado. In the short term, working from home is all about the pandemic. Make things work, do as much as you can from home, and we'll see where we're at on the other side of the pandemic. In the long term, it's all about where workers want to be, where they want to live. And so this is one of the reasons why Oregon looks really good in this metric. Everywhere in the state, whether you're in far-flung rural communities or in the valley or on the coast or in the mountains, wherever it is, in Oregon, you're average or above average in working from home. And places like Bend and Hood River are 2 of the highest work from home places in the entire country. It's about where people want to live in nice geographic locations, which of course the whole state has to a certain degree. And so Oregon stands to benefit. The key question here is whether this work from home will be 1 or 2 days a week, or whether it'll be entirely full-time remote. If it's only partially time, you know, even if you have to be in the office 1 day a week, you're still not going to live very far away. You might want to live in the suburbs or the exurbs in that first rural rung of community. Maybe you could commute from the coast into Hillsborough, or you could commute from Mount Hood into, you know, East Portland, or whatever the case may be. It's a long commute, but if you only have to do it once a week or twice a month or whatever the case may be, you're willing to make that trade-off associated with larger properties, a larger home, or whatever the case may be. That won't really change the dynamic entirely. Now, if this turns into full-time remote work, then we could see different patterns emerge. Then we could see stronger growth in our more rural areas in terms of, you know, all along the coast, or in Southern Oregon and Klamath and the like, that have a lot of the same scenic beauty further away from a lot of the traditional job centers associated with Oregon's economy. That question is yet to be determined. It's likely to be based upon individual companies, whether they say you can work from home 2 days a week or you only have to be in the office once a quarter. That distinction matter considerably for where people live and what the long run impact would be. The other important thing to point out is that working from home diversifies our local economies. Really good news. People are saying, hey, I want to live in your community, but I can't find a local job that suits my needs. So I'm either going to bring one with me, telecommuting or remote work, or I'm going to start a local business. And so working from home tend to be highly concentrated in things like math and science occupations, engineering, architecture, publishing, and the like. Some of these, you know, higher wage, white collar professional type jobs tend to work from home at much higher degrees than other types of jobs. And so when they start their own business or bring one with them, they're adding these types of jobs that aren't as prevalent in the local communities, which diversifies the regional economy, which should make it more resilient over the long run, which is tremendous news to the extent that we'll actually see this happening. So the bottom line on the revenue side is really good news for public sector revenues, in the sense in the near term, we haven't seen any impacts associated with the pandemic, or not very large ones. You know, we've raised our forecast by about $2 billion in the current 1921 biennium that ends next summer. And we've raised the other forecast by $1 billion, $1.5 billion in the years ahead. Now you can see in the chart, In the current biennium 1921, the dark blue line is basically back to the red line. That means there's as much money the legislature has to spend in the general fund this forecast as they did pre-COVID, which is the shocking part, that the tax collections haven't slowed down at all. But you can see in the longer run, the dark blue line is still lower, right? We're not all the way back. We think that recessionary shock that's still building, that's going to come to fruition. That's going to impact tax collections in the years ahead. And so we're not out of the woods. We're out of the woods today from a state budget perspective, knock on wood. But over the long term, this recessionary shock, we can't entirely just wipe it away and think it's going to be nothing when you lose 15% of your jobs or 14% of your jobs. And so it's going to take a while to get back. It's going to translate into fewer resources in the years ahead. At the local level, for local governments, property taxes, it's going to be all about ability to pay on the residential side. So far, so good on the income perspective. So I think, we're only a couple months out from property tax bills being due, but that's a key consideration. On the commercial real estate side of things, in commercial real estate, property taxes, the issue there is that business closure risk. The more businesses we see closed, the more vacancies we'll have, the more they'll weigh on rents, the more they'll weigh on property valuation. So it's an ability to pay, that if you have a bunch of vacant storefronts, the property owner might not be able to pay their taxes, and then future valuations are a key risk. I think commercial real estate is probably the biggest medium-term risk to our outlook. For all those reasons I was just talking about. Shared revenues from the state are all up in terms of lottery, in terms of marijuana, in terms of liquor-related taxes. Those are all up. The forecast has been raised. Tobacco taxes are relatively unchanged. And transportation, right? Transportation should still be down. We're still driving less than we did a year ago, but that's considerably better than expected. The last numbers I have from ODOT is driving's down about 7% relative to last year. We're almost all the way back to our normal driving patterns, not quite, but that should also help help improve revenues for transportation related measures as well. And that's everything I had prepared. I blew past my time, but we think we still have a couple times for some questions to the extent that you have them. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Great presentation. We have 3 questions in Q&A right now, and we also have 2 questions in chat. So would you like to take a look at those and get to those, please?
Yes, Dennis. We'll start with Dennis. Thanks. Hey, buddy. Housing shortage, residential construction. I think the housing market is one of the strongest sectors that's out there. On the ownership buying single family side, the multifamily is seeing a little more weakness. There's a large pipeline still to go on those apartments. It'll be a question how many of those get pulled back. I'm not sure. That's something to watch. But on the single family, it's demand is there. One way you can think about it, and my way I think about it, is recessions sometimes have this way of pulling forward long-term structural changes. And we know we have long-term positive boost to ownership, single-family homes, because the millennials, by the end of this decade, during the course of this decade, millennials will fully be in their 30s and their 40s, which are prime home buying years. So the underlying demographics in the economy are some of the best we have ever seen for home buying in single-family homes. And so that, combined with the fact that higher income households haven't been impacted as much to date. Higher income households tend to be owners, not renters. The rental market has been hit hardest given the nature of employment and incomes. Plus these record low mortgage rates. So I think those 3 factors, right? The demographics, the nature of the recession, and the mortgage rates, the interest rates, have really pulled forward a lot of this housing demand. And plus, then we had the normal spring selling season and listing season was shut down. And so some of this summer stuff is just makeup activity, but all those reasons mean housing is really, really strong today. And it should be strong for the next decade, relatively speaking. So that's the view. And then the question on the rebuilding of the fires, we have 4,000 lost homes. We have 2,000 built into our forecast, additional units. That's probably about what we can do. The question is supply capacity. Do we have enough capacity in the construction industry today to build an additional 4,000 units tomorrow? The answer is no, right? So in the rebuilding phase, are we going to be taking resources, industry capacity away from Portland and taking it and putting it into Santiam Canyon to rebuild homes? we might, right? I think there's some constraints there that we couldn't build 4,000 units tomorrow, even if we wanted to, or we need to. So, okay, Gwen asked about gas tax and lottery revenues. The gas taxes, I don't know the specific numbers. My counterpart at ODOT is Dan Porter. He's really good. He's actually putting out a forecast in a couple months. He'll have updated numbers on that, but they probably follow that VMT, the vehicle miles traveled data, closer than in terms of our fuel efficiency is actually getting worse. We're buying more and more trucks and less cars, so we're having to buy more gas to drive the same miles. But that's another thing. Lottery revenues. So we built in substantial declines due to the pandemic. We're giving it back about 40% of those. So the revenue for lottery is up, but not up all the way pre-COVID. And so that's up. So it's a bonding capacity and shared revenues associated with that are improving. So that's something to keep in mind. Moving forward, Treasury, as I speak, Treasury is updating the bonding capacity. So we'll see what they come up with. Andrew, you noted state tax collections looking strong. Whether for local jurisdictions, I think that's going to vary. I know some of the business taxes and the like at the city of Portland and Multnomah County are doing well. They're seeing the same sort of things we're seeing on the corporate side at the state. So that would be good news. The transportation, I think, is better than feared. And so that's kind of all again, on the property taxes, not going to be about valuations on the residential side. Valuations will keep going up. It's about ability to pay. So it'll be about delinquent accounts. That would be the biggest concern. Brad, did they, for the fires, take them to the construction? Yeah, that's kind of getting at the capacity issue of whether there's going to be additional construction activity or just kind of shifting it around and maybe would cause delays in other projects. So that's something, yeah, the labor constraint. We're hearing that more and more out of manufacturing and construction is not so much that the drop in demand is hurting their business. Their business is doing okay. They can't find enough labor, which is the same discussion we've been having in recent years with the stronger economy.
Josh,
yeah.
We have a couple questions in the chat. One is from Tom Goodhue, who says this slide is obviously less government assistance. Do you have the same with assistance? And I believe he was talking about your fourth slide.
The income slide is the top line. The total blue line is with government assistance. The light blue line is without. So the total is above. We're about 5% higher incomes today than we were pre-COVID. Without the assistance, we're 5% less than we were pre-COVID. And so that's like a 10 percentage point impact from the federal aid.
The other question in the chat is from Mayor Truax. He says, my concern is that our economic disturbance is not being shared by all of us across the board. What can we do to ensure that the recovery will not leave some behind? Unfortunately, our history is that some groups get left behind, whether it is economic recovery using development, transportation access to healthcare, etc. We can't afford economically or morally to continue down this road. Having said all that, he thanks you for explaining all this to us and using small words so that not just Mayor Truax, but all of us can get it.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that. Right. So the three main disparities we're always concerned about are income disparities, inequality, widening, geographic disparities, urban-rural distinctions, and racial disparities in terms of different outcomes by race and ethnicity. Right now, we have limited good data, except that the income stuff by sector, that's good data, right? And so we know that between the continued high valuations of asset markets, yeah, they've come down the last couple of weeks, but the asset markets, stock markets have done quite well. Real estate's doing quite well. Between that, coupled with the fact that low-wage workers have borne the brunt of the recession, we know income inequality is being exacerbated today. The other types of disparities, the urban-rural, the racial and ethnic, what little information we have shows that those are not widening today. In fact, a lot of Eastern and Southern Oregon are doing better than the Willamette Valley, and certainly better than the coast and the gorge, which are more travel tourism dependent. So some of our rural communities, at least in the real-time data, are doing better. Now revisions can change that. Real-time local level data always subject to revision, so a big qualifier on that. But The urban-rural divide isn't worsening today. In fact, it's on the margin, it's improving, right? Portland is doing worse than the state average today, which is not what we saw last decade. On the racial and ethnic, it looks to be like everyone got laid off proportionately. There's not some different mix. It's not like, Black Oregonians work in totally different industries than white Oregonians or Asian Oregonians or the like. And so if we kind of look at that industrial mix of who works in what types of jobs, they all look pretty similar. And so the expectations are that as long as businesses laid off workers proportionately, then we're not going to see disparities. If we do start to see racial and ethnic disparities emerge, it's not going to be due to the economy itself. It's going to be due to other factors, including, whatever. Maybe they laid off people of color to a larger degree than their white employees. That could factor in, but we don't know that yet. We're still waiting on better data. So again, out of the three main disparities that you're talking about leaving people behind, one of them we know for sure is happening with income inequality. The racial and the geographic still be determined. We expect some gaps to emerge, but they're not yet, at least in the data.
So back to the questions in the chat, we have a question from, to the Q&A from Nina Carlson. Will the economic development from recovery dollars for smaller towns down Santiam create a financial and community uplift for those areas?
They might. In looking at some insurance data, not local data, but just broader insurance market research, it looks like private insurance covers about 75% of the losses, at least in past years, in big wildfire years. So that means you're not going to get 100%. Now, what is that gap, and how much does like FEMA plug that gap? I don't know. That's something to be concerned about. The other thing to be concerned about is level of insurance. A lot of policies, you insure your structure for $200,000, you get another $100,000 in personal belonging insurance that goes with that. You get about 50%, sometimes 70%. Now, were all of the homes that were lost properly insured to the full extent that would cost not just their current market valuation, but the new construction cost? If it costs $400,000 to build a house and you're only insured for $200,000, what's going to happen, right? Like, that's not a good outcome. And so that sort of nuance associated with the specifics, it's going to take a while to figure that out. But the fingers crossed is that we're gonna get a lot of it back. I'm confident in that. We're not going to have ghost towns, but whether we get the full rebuild in Mill City and in Lyons and whatnot, that's still to be determined. I think that's a big risk.
Thank you. Jeff Petrio asks, do you believe we will see a bump in the population growth from in-migration due to the Californians leaving their state as a result of wildfires?
That could change. Californians are always the largest number of folks moving here. They're always a plurality. 30 to 40% every year of people moving into Oregon come from California. That has been true for the dawn of time. Now, the offsetting factors here is migration slows in recessions. People hunker down when job opportunities are scarce. So any pandemic or wildfire related migration is going to be a little harder to see, say, this year and next because of the bad economy. We expect migration to slow. A lot of people think, oh, well, aren't a bunch of people moving to Oregon because of the pandemic and they're going to work remotely or whatever? It's like, well, maybe, but we don't have good data on that yet. And the normal recessionary patterns of migration flows are probably, our forecast says, they're going to be larger than any sort of short-term pandemic-related migration or wildfire migration. So that's, but yeah, again, the wildfires generate the most migration, the largest migration differences out of disasters. So we're certainly watching that moving forward.
Thank you, Josh. Quick question for you. Can you stay 5 minutes past 9 to see if we can get through these questions? We normally end right at 9 o'clock, but I'd like to see if we can get through these questions, but we will end at 5 after. Daryl Nelson asked about the expected impact on the economy and consumers who are unable to pay their rent, their utility bills, and the eviction moratoriums.
I think this is a big risk, certainly for property owners. I'm not sure. We got conflicting reports. There's some national data from rental property owners. They tend to be the bigger ones, the ones that own a lot of properties. has shown a little bit of erosion in rent payments, not a ton, not as much as you would expect given the shock, but a little bit, which is concerning. That's kind of consistent. We're seeing a little bit. There's a Census Bureau survey that we get some Oregon data on too. It happens like every week or every couple of weeks. And it's not showing a massive change in the responses to the ability to pay mortgages and rents. Now that said, that doesn't really match with the stories we're hearing. And there was that new survey that Portland State did with the CAT, right, the Community Alliance of Tenants, just the other day. I saw written up in Willamette Week that showed larger impact. So it's still, I think it's a big risk. We don't have a good handle on it. I think that impact of the recession across the distribution, where low income folks have been impacted more, plus the loss of federal assistance, plus the fact that jobs remain scarce, all of those factors lead to what you're getting at. I think it's going to be an issue, but how large, we can't wrap our hands around that yet. But I think those issues are real.
Thank you. And Carolyn McCormick asks, or states, first of all, that this is positive information overall. Do you have any insight on the impact of dramatic decline in transient lodging tax and programs, services, and buildings funded with those revenues?
Yeah, I think we've seen some scattering news over the summer that we saw some pretty good numbers. I think Central Oregon saw hotel occupancies in the 92% range, just really high numbers, which would be good news for those associated with revenues. But we've seen other numbers that are much worse. Talk to the people in the restaurant and lodging industry at the association. They're running 40-60% capacity, so those numbers are way down. That's going to feed directly in. Even the numbers on the coast weren't great. They're good on the weekend, but they're bad during the week. So again, not only for business closures, it's hard to run a business at 50% sales. Like, you can't do that. And so that's going to directly translate into lower revenues. I think that's going to be some of the last stuff to come back, particularly the business related stuff. I think Travel Oregon says, business travel is 25% of all travel, right? So that's going to be the very last stuff to come back. Convention center stuff, that's going to be in for a tough slog, a really long time, I expect.
Thank you. Blake Herring asks, do you see homeless numbers increasing, and what is the impact on Portland in the longer term? In the commercial sector. The folks, the advocates for homelessness that I talk to on a semi-regular basis, they're all indicating it's gone up. I think there was a report done, I don't know if it was PBA did it, I know Echo Northwest did the underlying work. The Echo Northwest report, I felt like, did a good job of talking it through. One of the issues there is all the people on the margins that were just barely making rent. You lose one paycheck and you're done, right? That sort of thing. That given the nature of the recession, that is probably where some of this increase in homelessness would come from, is those people that were working low wage jobs and they lost them, and then they have nowhere to go. And so that sort of assistance, I think, will increase. What's going to happen with Portland long term? I think downtown will be okay, right? Theoretically, it's only like 10 blocks that are ported up, but those are very important 10 blocks. And so it's bad right now, but I think it will get better, and it'll return when the office workers return and the like. Now, whether that's what it looks like before, or we are only going to be in the office 4 days a week or something, I think that'll matter in terms of the shops and the restaurants and everything that relies on those workers at lunchtime. That could all see some permanent changes, relatively speaking, but it's still way too early to know. So you have one last question, but it's tied to the question that you answered previously. How has your forecast been impacted by the rental eviction moratorium expiring soon, and renters will be required to make catch-up payments for any that they missed or skipped?
That's a policy question, probably driven out of the governor's office. I know that moratorium's ending soon, and she is debating what to do about it. We know on the commercial side, restaurants can't make up 5 months of rent payments, right? They're not going to be able to just say, hey, here's 5 months at one time. I assume the same would happen on the residential, particularly in a lot of these properties that have been, where the lower income workers would live, and they're the ones that have lost their jobs the most. I don't believe the financial I don't believe the money will be there to make up multiple months rent. How that all shakes out, I don't know. Again, I think that's a big risk, and it's something we're worried about, but we also lack really good data on that sort of thing.
Josh, once again, I want to say thank you for the great job that you always do for us in explaining what the forecast looks like, explaining what the impacts of the variety of situations that we find ourselves in are. You do an excellent job, and we really appreciate it. We're looking forward to next quarter getting on your calendar right away. So thank you very much. I want to remind all the participants that yes, this presentation has been recorded, and we do have Josh's slides. We will be posting those on our website for your review. So keep that in mind as you move forward. I also want to let you know what our upcoming events are. We've got several events coming up. Treece will put a slide up about that. But again, most importantly, I want to thank our sponsors. We have a great relationship with PGE. I want to thank you for your ongoing support of Westside Economic Alliance. And Dave, thank you for being with us this morning. And again, to Legacy for your continued support as well. So we're ending just a few minutes after the hour, but I appreciate Josh staying with us and getting through all of our questions. The last thing I'd like to remind you is that you will be getting an electronic survey in the next couple days. Please fill that out. We spend a lot of time looking at your comments. We take into consideration all of the pieces that you and the feedback that you give us in continuing to try to make these presentations valuable, informational, and something that you look forward to. So Josh, thank you. Dave, thank you. And thanks to all of our participants. Stay safe.